All right. Let's get into it because I've been sitting on this one for a couple of days and I don't think people are connecting the dots the way they should be. Everybody wants to talk about whether Israel is going to hit Iran again. That's the wrong question. The right question, the one nobody in Jerusalem wants to say out loud on camera, is whether Israel still has the time, and I mean the actual physical time, the industrial time, to keep doing what it's been doing. And I'll tell you right now, the clock that matters isn't the one ticking in Tehran. It's the one ticking in Washington. Here's what set me off. There's reporting, and I trust this reporting because it lines up with everything I'm hearing through my own channels, that senior U.S. officials got genuinely irritated. That's the word being used, irritated with Israel for continuing to push for a resumption of strikes on Iran. Not because Washington suddenly grew a conscience about the war. Because every time Israel leans on the White House to go again, somebody in the Pentagon has to look at a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet is not pretty. I'm going to walk you through exactly what's on that spreadsheet in a minute, because once you see the numbers, you understand why this irritation is real and why it's not going away and why it actually might be the single most important factor in whether this war restarts or whether it stays frozen in this uneasy truce we're all watching right now. Let me back up for a second, because I want you to understand exactly how we got to this point. And I promise this isn't going to be a history lecture. It's going to be fast because you need the context, or none of what I say later is going to land the way it should. This war effectively restarted at the end of February when Israel and the United States hit Iranian military and government targets and took out its supreme leader in the process. Iran hit back hard, missiles, drones, hit the Strait, hit oil infrastructure, hit U.S.-aligned states in the Gulf, and for about 5 weeks, this thing burned at an intensity most of us haven't seen in that region in decades. Then in early April, Pakistan brokers a pause. 2 weeks, extended again, and by mid-June, you've got the presidents of both countries actually putting a pen to paper on a memorandum. That's the surface story. That's what you read in the headlines. But underneath that surface story, there's a second story, and it's the one I actually want to talk to you about today, because here's what the headlines don't tell you. Israel's own defense minister, a few weeks after that April ceasefire, told people plainly that the moment Washington gives the green light, Israel is ready to, and I'm using his own phrase here, bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages. That's not a fringe voice. That's the sitting defense minister. And on the other side of the Israeli political map, you've got the opposition leader calling the ceasefire one of the greatest political disasters in the country's history. So you've already got a fractured political establishment, half of it convinced the war ended too early, convinced Iran walked away without being properly finished, and polling out of Israel backs that up. A majority telling pollsters they think ending the war when it ended ran against their own security interests. That's the domestic pressure Netanyahu is operating under. That's the environment generating all this push to go again. And that push runs straight into the wall I'm about to describe to you, a wall built out of interceptors and production schedules that nobody in that political conversation seems to be accounting for. So let's set the table properly. Back in June, the presidents of the United States and Iran sat down and signed a memorandum of understanding. 60 days. That's the window they gave themselves to turn a ceasefire that was already shaky into something that resembles an actual end to this thing. 60 days sounds like a long time when you say it out loud, but I've spent enough of my life around military planning to tell you that 60 days evaporates. It evaporates especially fast when you've got 3 separate flashpoints all trying to blow up that window at the same time, and that's exactly what we've got. Lebanon, the Strait of Hormuz, and a nuclear file that nobody can even verify anymore because the inspectors can't get in. I'm going to get to all 3. But I want you to hold on to that number, 60 days, because by the time we're done here today, you're going to understand just how little of that window is actually left and how much of it Israel has already burned through arguing with its own closest ally, because that's the story that isn't being told. Everyone's watching Netanyahu and Khamenei like it's a boxing match, like the only thing that decides round 2 is whether one of them blinks first. That's not how this works anymore. The real fight, the fight that decides whether this war restarts, is happening between Jerusalem and Washington, and it's a fight over hardware, over stockpiles, over who's going to pay the bill the next time Iran lights up the sky with 100 ballistic missiles in a single night. I was in rooms once, a long time ago, where decisions like that got made, and I promise you, nobody in those rooms was thinking about headlines. They were thinking about inventory. And inventory, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what's about to run out. Now, let me give you the numbers, because I don't do vague on this channel. I don't do vibes. I do arithmetic. During the 40 days of fighting before the April ceasefire, the United States fired more interceptors defending Israel than Israel fired defending itself. More than 200 THAAD interceptors, which by most estimates is somewhere close to half of the entire U.S. THAAD inventory. On top of that, over 100 standard missile interceptors, the SM-3s and SM-6s that the Navy uses. Israel, meanwhile, fired fewer than 100 Arrow interceptors and around 90 David's Sling interceptors of its own. Sit with that for a second. The United States burned through half its most advanced missile defense inventory, protecting a country that isn't the United States. That's not a footnote. That's the entire ball game. And here's the part that should really worry anybody paying attention. Replacing those Arrow interceptors, rebuilding that stockpile back to where it was before this war started, that's not a 6-month job. Estimates are running 2 to 3 years, even with accelerated production lines working around the clock. You cannot manufacture precision-guided interceptors the way you manufacture rifles. Every one of these things has a propulsion system, a guidance package, sourced components that come from a supply chain with long lead times measured in months per unit, not days. So when people ask me whether Israel can just keep doing what it's doing, keep pushing for another round against Iran whenever it wants, I tell them, sure, Israel can push. The question is whether the allies supplying the interceptors that keep Israeli skies from getting perforated can keep saying yes. And right now, the honest answer is that ally is running the numbers, and the numbers are making people nervous. It gets worse when you factor in what Iran figured out mid-war, which is that cluster warheads complicate interception in a way that eats through inventory even faster. Though Israel certainly tried, approving something in the neighborhood of $800 million in emergency classified procurement just to start clawing back what the war had already consumed. And I want to be fair here because there's a counter argument, and a good analyst deals with the counter argument instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Israeli officials and some defense commentators have pushed back hard on the idea that any of this constitutes a crisis, pointing out that modern wars always drain stockpiles, that this happened in the last round too, back in 2025, and Israel got through it fine. That's a fair point as far as it goes, but it dodges the actual question, which isn't whether Israel survived the last drawdown. It's whether the current drawdown, stacked directly on top of a previous one that was never fully replenished, leaves enough margin for a third round if this ceasefire collapses in August. Survivable once is not the same thing as sustainable indefinitely, and I think that distinction is exactly what's getting lost in the reassurances coming out of Jerusalem right now. You want more proof this isn't speculation. This isn't some retired officer connecting dots that aren't there. Go look at what happened in front of the Senate a few weeks back. The acting Navy secretary got asked point blank about a $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan that Congress had already approved. And his answer, I'm paraphrasing here, but only barely, was that they're doing a pause to make sure they have what they need for the operation against Iran. Think about what that actually means. The United States government is telling its own Congress in a public hearing that supporting a treaty partner in the Pacific has to wait because the munitions pipeline is tied up, keeping Israel's air defense fed. That is not a small thing. That is a superpower admitting in a room full of senators that it cannot simultaneously arm two theaters at full strength. And if you think Beijing isn't reading that transcript very closely, you're not paying attention to how this game actually works. So now you understand the leash. It's not political sentiment. It's not some senator having a change of heart about the special relationship. It's physics. It's production timelines. It's the fact that Donald Trump himself, and I want you to hear the actual words because they matter, said, quote, "I call the shots. I call all the shots," referring directly to Netanyahu. Now, normally I'd tell you that's just a president talking tough for a domestic audience. But layer that quote on top of the Senate testimony, on top of the interceptor math, and it stops sounding like bravado. It starts sounding like a man who genuinely understands that his own military's ability to support Israel has limits, and he is not going to let Jerusalem write checks that the Pentagon's supply chain can't cash. And this isn't just talk either, because we've actually seen it exercised in real time. There was a night not that long ago where Israeli jets were already in the air, already inbound toward targets in Iran in retaliation for a strike, and reporting at the time was that Trump personally pressured Netanyahu to call the mission back. Israel mostly complied. The retaliation got scaled down to something much smaller than what was originally planned. That's not a president issuing a strongly worded statement after the fact. That's a president reaching into an active operational decision and shrinking it in real time. If you're looking for evidence that the leash is real, that it isn't just rhetoric for cable news, that's about as concrete as it gets. An actual strike package getting reduced mid-mission because Washington said, pump the brakes. And I'd ask you to sit with the irony of that for a second. Because for decades, the entire framing of the special relationship was Washington restraining Israel diplomatically, vetoes at the UN, statements about proportionality, that sort of thing. What we're watching now is a completely different mechanism of restraint, one that has nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with hardware. It's not that Washington disagrees with Israel's objectives. By every indication, the administration would like to see Iran's program dismantled just as much as Netanyahu would. It's that the men actually running the logistics know something the politicians giving speeches don't seem to fully internalize, which is that you cannot sustain a third major air campaign on the current inventory without gutting your ability to respond to a crisis literally anywhere else on the planet, and that includes the Pacific, and that includes Europe. And every rational planner in that building knows it. There's a defense official quoted not long ago saying something that I think sums up the entire dynamic better than any analyst piece I've read, something to the effect of stockpiles are now part of the escalation calculus. Read that phrase again slowly, because it inverts the way most people still think about this war. We're used to thinking about escalation in terms of intent. Does Netanyahu want to hit Iran again? Does Khamenei's inner circle want to retaliate? This official is telling you escalation now runs through a magazine count first and an intent second. The question stopped being, can we strike, and became, what are we willing to spend to strike? And what does spending it cost us everywhere else we might need to fight tomorrow? That's a fundamentally different war than the one being described on the cable news panels. And it's the one I think you actually need to understand if you want to know what happens next. All right, let's move to the second front, because interceptors are only half the equation. The other half is geography, and this is where I think most of the commentary out there gets lazy. People treat this like it's one conflict with one clock. It's not. It's three separate fires, each burning on its own timeline, each one capable of blowing up that 60-day window entirely on its own, and Israel does not have the bandwidth, the stockpiles, or, frankly, the diplomatic capital to put all three of them out at the same time. Start with Lebanon. Hezbollah has flatly rejected the terms of the broader ceasefire framework. Now, here's the technical detail that matters and that almost nobody explains properly. Lebanon isn't even a party to that June memorandum. Neither is the Lebanese government. So you've got this bizarre situation where the headline deal, the one everyone's calling a step toward peace, doesn't actually cover the front where Israeli jets are still active on a near weekly basis. That's not an oversight. That's a structural gap to get a signature on the easy front. And then 6 months later, everybody acts shocked when the hard front reignites the whole thing. Second front, the Strait of Hormuz. This one gets treated like an economic story, tankers, oil prices, insurance premiums. It is an economic story, but it's also a pure leverage play, and I want you to see it that way, because that's how Tehran sees it. Iran has closed and reopened access through that strait multiple times now, each time using it as a pressure valve completely separate from whatever's happening on the nuclear file. You can have a nuclear negotiation going reasonably well in Doha and simultaneously have oil tankers stacking up outside Hormuz because Iran wants to remind everyone it still holds a card that has nothing to do with centrifuges. That's sophisticated. That's a government that understands escalation dominance doesn't require a single lever. It requires multiple levers you can pull independently so your opponent never knows which fire to put out first. And we saw exactly this play out in real time not long ago, a fresh exchange of missiles and drones between Israel and Iran, the first in weeks, triggered by Israeli strikes on Beirut. And within hours, Brent crude jumped back above $97 a barrel. That's the market pricing and exactly what I'm describing to you. The recognition that this entire structure is one Beirut strike, one Hormuz incident, away from unraveling, regardless of what the diplomats are signing in Doha. And that's the other piece of this. The negotiations haven't stopped. U.S. and Iranian delegations were sitting down in separate meetings in Qatar as recently as the 1st of July, agreeing to keep talking. So you've got this strange parallel track, formal diplomacy grinding forward in one room, while in effect, a completely separate escalation clock keeps resetting itself in the Mediterranean and in the Gulf. Anyone telling you this is a simple binary war or peace hasn't been paying attention to how many tracks are actually running simultaneously here. And third, the nuclear file itself, which is somehow simultaneously the most talked about and the least understood piece of this entire situation. The IAEA cannot verify Iran's enrichment status right now. Not because Iran has kicked out every inspector and slammed the door. It's messier than that. It's about Iran refusing normal inspection protocols at facilities that got struck during the war, insisting on codified rules for how internationally protected sites get treated once they've been bombed, essentially demanding the agency condemn the strikes before it will resume normal verification. So you've got international observers who genuinely do not know, cannot confirm whether Iran is quietly reconstituting a weapons-capable stockpile or whether it's sitting exactly where it was left after the strikes. Analysts have started calling this nuclear hedging, developing the technical infrastructure to assemble something on short notice while stopping just short of the line that would force everyone's hand. That ambiguity is not an accident. Strategic ambiguity on a nuclear program is one of the oldest plays in the book, and Iran is running it beautifully right now, whether you want to give them credit for that or not. And layer onto that the disagreement inside Iran's own government, because even they aren't unified on this. There's reporting of daylight between the country's supreme leader and its elected president over how far to bend on the terms of that June memorandum, with word getting out that the supreme leader has a, quote, different view on some of what was agreed, even after signing off on it. If you needed one more reason to distrust the idea that this nuclear file gets cleanly resolved inside 60 days, that's it right there. You're not negotiating with a single unified Iranian position. You're negotiating with a government that is itself still arguing about how much ground it's willing to give, which means every concession Washington thinks it's banked in Doha could get walked back the moment it gets back to Tehran. So walk with me through what this actually means operationally, because this is where I think my perspective, having spent a career thinking about exactly this kind of problem, actually adds something the pundit class misses. Israel cannot commit its full weight to Lebanon without watching Hormuz, and it cannot watch Hormuz without keeping enough of its air defense reserved for a potential Iranian missile barrage, and it cannot fully mobilize against that barrage risk without pulling resources away from monitoring the nuclear file, which brings you right back around to why the interceptor math I gave you earlier matters so much. 3 fronts, 1 finite stockpile, 1 ally whose patience and whose warehouse are both being tested at the same time. That is not a sustainable posture. That is a country trying to hold 3 tigers by 3 separate tails, and eventually your hands get tired. I want to be precise about why this is different from previous rounds of this same broader conflict, because skeptics will tell you Israel has juggled multiple fronts before and managed fine Gaza and Lebanon and Syria all at once not that long ago, and that's a fair historical point. But the difference this time is the adversary directly across the border isn't a non-state militia operating with whatever it can smuggle in. It's a state actor with a domestic missile and drone production base that survived the February strikes intact enough to keep launching sustained waves for weeks afterward. Juggling Gaza and Lebanon simultaneously is a resource allocation problem. Juggling Iran, Lebanon, and Hormuz simultaneously, while your primary air defense supplier is publicly triaging its own global commitments, is a completely different category of problem. And I think conflating the two is exactly where a lot of the confident predictions you're hearing elsewhere start to fall apart. Now, here's where I want to bring this all the way back to that 60-day number, because that's really the whole point of what we're talking about today. That memorandum was signed on June 17th. Do the math yourself. That window closes in the middle of August. And when I look at where things actually stand right now, the interceptor stockpiles still recovering, the Senate publicly admitting munitions triage, Hezbollah openly rejecting the framework, Hormuz still being used as a pressure valve, the IAEA still locked out of proper verification. I don't see a picture of a region converging toward a clean resolution before that deadline. I see a picture of a region where every single piece is still live, still unresolved, still capable of igniting independently of the others. And I think, and I want to be careful how I say this, because I'm not in the business of making predictions I can't back up. But I think what actually happens in the middle of August depends far less on what Netanyahu wants and far less even on what Khamenei's people decide than it does on a much quieter conversation happening in the Pentagon and in defense contractor boardrooms about production schedules and reload timelines. That's the actual decision point. Not a summit, not a speech, a supply chain review. I'll give you the 3 ways I think this realistically breaks. And I want to be honest that none of them are clean. Simply doesn't allow for a full-scale resumption. And what you get instead is exactly what we're living through right now, stretched out further. Low-intensity flare-ups, a Beirut strike here, a Hormuz incident there, oil spiking and settling, without anyone ever formally declaring the war back on or the peace secured. A second path, the domestic political pressure inside Israel, the cat swing, the part of the electorate telling pollsters the war ended too soon. That pressure eventually forces Washington's hand, regardless of the spreadsheet, and you get a compressed, shorter, more desperate campaign that tries to accomplish in days what the previous round tried to accomplish in weeks, precisely because everyone involved knows the stockpile won't support anything longer. And a third path frankly, the one I'd bet on if you made me pick, the 60-day window quietly expires without a clean resolution on any of the three fronts, gets extended again the way the April truce kept getting extended, and this entire structure just keeps limping forward on borrowed time because nobody, not Jerusalem, not Washington, not Tehran, actually wants to be the party that owns the collapse. But even that third path, the muddle through path, has an expiration date because you cannot muddle through a magazine abyss forever. Eventually, the reload has to catch up to the expenditure, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, the leash Washington's been quietly holding stops being a policy choice and becomes a hard physical ceiling, whether anyone in Jerusalem wants to accept that framing or not. So here's the question I keep coming back to, the one I don't think anyone in Jerusalem wants to answer honestly on camera. What happens when Israel's own strategic patience runs ahead of Washington's industrial capacity to support it? What happens the day the answer to can we go again isn't a political no, it's a logistical no. It's an ally that simply does not have the interceptors sitting in the warehouse to say yes, because that day is coming. And based on everything I've just walked you through, it might be coming faster than 60 days. It might be coming faster than the memorandum itself was ever designed to survive. And I don't think the region, or frankly the markets, are anywhere close to ready for what that actually looks like when it arrives. And that irritation I mentioned at the very start of this, the one coming out of Washington, I don't think that's a mood. I think that's a warning shot nobody's decided to listen to yet. Look, I don't say any of this to tell you the sky is falling, and I don't say it to tell you Israel's finished, because it isn't, not remotely. What I'm telling you is that the entire conversation around this war needs to shift away from who's bluffing and who's serious and toward who actually has the reload capacity to back up whatever they're threatening. That's the lens I use for every conflict I look at. And it's the lens almost nobody applies here because it's boring, because spreadsheets don't trend the way a missile strike trends. But spreadsheets are what end wars just as often as diplomacy does, sometimes more often. And I think August is going to teach a lot of very confident people a very uncomfortable lesson about that. All right, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.